Archaeologists find strange objects in river that now have experts in a frenzy. Relic hunters and history lovers, hold on to your hats. There's nothing more exciting than venturing out into the wilderness with a metal detector and discovering buried treasure just inches underground. Old war bullets, historical tools, and ancient coins lie waiting right under your nose. Years of study, however, suggested these three South Carolina men would need something larger than a metal detector. Guided by mapping equipment, excavators, and a distant memory, they believed they were on the precipice of a major relic from history. On September 29, 2015, Jonathan Leader, Chris Ammer, and Michael Hartley stood on the banks of the Pee Dee River, beaming with joy. They hoped they were seconds closer to finding the answers to a 150-year-old mystery. The trio had spent the past decade searching for a ship, the CSS Pee Dee, that was wrecked over a century earlier along the river for which she was named. The vessel, which dated back to the winter of 1865, was integral to the area's history. The Pee Dee had been built in a Confederate port in January of that year, only 2 months before the Civil War was finally over. But why had a Confederate ship been destroyed by its own crew, in its own territory? You see, towards the end of the Civil War, the Union had sent its ships south to create a blockade at every Confederate port along the coast. No supplies were allowed through to the Confederacy, and the southern states were getting frantic. Because of the sheer size of the Union, it had more than 3 times the number of ships as a Confederacy. The South's Navy was no match for the North, but they desperately needed those supplies. So they came up with a plan. To try to break the blockade, the South began building ships at inland ports, upriver from the coast. Pee Dee was one of these new ships, and she was armed with 3 cannons, 2 Brook cannons and 1 Dahlgren, to fend off any attack. But by the time she was finished, Pee Dee only ever saw one mission. She provided protection for a simple and uneventful river crossing, and it's believed her cannons were never even fired. So when she went down, the guns were still brand new. In March 1865, things heated up. Union troops were closing in, and Mars Bluff, Pee Dee's shipyard, was about to fall into their hands. Rather than give it up, the South burned the ship and Pee Dee too, but not before dropping her cannons into the river. As the river rose and fell, salvagers came to pull metal from Pee Dee's wreckage. They retrieved her propellers, and her broiler was taken in for scrap in 1954. Nothing else was left, or so it was thought. As it turned out, one 12-year-old boy had seen the boiler being salvaged. The river was low enough to see some of the wreckage, and he was so intrigued by it that he made a detailed map of its location. That boy was Michael Hartley. He never forgot the site, or the map. When Hartley grew older, he moved to North Carolina, where he became the head of archaeology at Old Salem Museum and Gardens, and Pee Dee's wreck still fascinated him. Hartley kept up with the news, scanning for signs of the old ship. In 2010, he was rewarded. Jonathan Leader, South Carolina state archaeologist, knew about the shipwreck too, and made headlines after he discovered a clue lying in the riverbed. Working with underwater specialist Chris Ammer, Leader had been taking sonar readings of the river near Mars Bluff. The pair was unlucky until their scans picked up a curious pattern of heavy iron bolts laid out in the silt in a straight line. This straight line wasn't a pattern normally found in nature, and Leader and Ammer were ecstatic. They were almost certain that they'd found the ship's remains, but they needed to confirm it. Hartley heard the news and got in touch. He told the 2 men what he had seen, all those years ago in 1954, and sent them his map. Leader and Ammer went back to the spot Hartley had labeled, took some magnetic readings, and sure enough, there it was. They couldn't believe their luck. With this find, they now knew the location of all 3 of Pee Dee's cannons, the only major artifacts still left from the ship. 2 of its cannons had been located downriver a few years before. Now they just needed to be recovered. Careful preparations began. In September 2015, layers of mud were removed from atop of the cannons, and thick straps were attached to their barrels. They were then moved closer to the shore for easier access. Finally, on September 29th, the removal day had arrived. A huge crowd gathered along the riverbank. As the excavator bent down and gently lifted the cannons out of the water, Hartley, Leader, and Amer couldn't have been more proud. The guns were carefully rinsed, then packed to send off to Clemson University for restoration. This closed the book on a lot of history. It's really special, remarked diver Bob Butler, who had helped locate the artifacts. After a 4-year restoration process, the cannons are almost new again, and they can be seen in Florence, South Carolina at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, a true testament to the fascinating history hiding just out of our sight.